A long time ago, in the year 1435 BCE, a large group of travelers were walking slowly through the Sinai Peninsula. They hoisted their meager belongings on their backs and trudged onwards, their feet taking them, against their will, away from their home. Around them, the desert wind swept by, flecks of dust and grit stinging their faces. The sunlight beat down on an arid landscape, bathing the weary travelers in the harsh light of a foreign god. The sunlight glinted off metal, spears and armor that were carried by ranks of men who cajoled and pushed, ushering the travelers forwards inexorably. If a traveler fell or stopped to catch their breath, they were pushed onwards or struck with a stick. The weary mass of humanity, marching unwillingly, was crossing the Sinai towards captivity. Ahead, the land of Egypt, and a new life of servitude. Hello, welcome to the History of Egypt podcast, episode 79, Let My People Go. Today, we begin to touch on one of the foundational events in Western history. As King Amunhotep II launches himself and his troops upon his enemies, he sets in motion a story that will ripple throughout the ages, and touch us even today through the legends and histories of the Hebrew Bible. Today's episode is a big one, and it is heavy on artistic references. As always, images for the episode can be found at EgyptianHistoryPodcast.com. Link in the episode description. While you're there, consider leaving a comment or suggestion. How are you finding the show? Any stories that you particularly want to hear? Head on over to EgyptianHistoryPodcast.com. I would love to hear from you. The year is 1437 BCE. It is regnal year 7 in the reign of Amunhotep II, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, ruler of the Nile, of Nubia, and of Canaan. It is a splendid time to be an Egyptian. The empire is strong, riches flow into Egypt from its captive territories, and the people are gaining access to more wealth than ever before. This wealth comes in the form of goods via trade, and of captive servants via military enslavement. As regnal year 7 began, Amunhotep was looking to add to his military resume. It had been 4 years since he last led a campaign. Now it was time to return to the warfield, to make the name of Pharaoh known and feared throughout the world. Amunhotep assembled an army. The Egyptian army gathered at the Pharaoh's command. Young men new to the ranks, old veterans adorned with marks of service, charioteers armoured and mobile with their war horses, strong and virile. Archers, rank upon rank, bows and arrows at the ready, completed the force. The warriors gathered on the riverbanks and at docks, to board ships, to make their way out of Egypt. Their destination, as always, was Syria. Syria, the land of 1,000 cities, the land of prosperity, the land of interminable threats. Recently, Amunhotep had received word of new threats in the lands of Syria. Some of his vassals, princes or cities, had stopped sending their regular tribute. They were now dangerously close to rebellion. Worse, troublemakers in the city of Ugarit were actually trying to expel their Egyptian garrison. Something had to be done. Well, Amunhotep was the man to do it. The king and his soldiers set sail from Egypt early in regnal year 7, about March or April. They set sail from the Nile Delta and sailed for the region of Lebanon. There they disembarked their ships and began a northward march. They could have sailed straight to Ugarit in Syria, the rebel territories, but that would have been sailing dangerously close to danger. Amunhotep was not rash. He disembarked further south, assessed the situation, and then marched to the trouble spots that needed him most. The king described it like this, quote, Year 7, the first month of harvest, day 25. His Majesty departed for Syria on his campaign of victory. He went to broaden his borders and to give property to those who were loyal to him. The loyal were made to take the oath of loyalty, and all of their children likewise." End quote. Amunhotep II liked to offer carrots before he offered sticks. Faced with trouble in northern Syria, the king made the rounds of his territories first. He visited the cities that were still loyal, and, quite wisely, made efforts to ensure that their loyalty continued. Amunhotep gave trinkets to the princes and rulers of these towns, probably gold or jewelry, gifts to ensure their continued service, to remind them how valued they were as loyal sons of the pharaoh. It was an exercise in calming the situation, of assuring everyone that the king of Egypt was a benevolent ruler, at least to those who obeyed. Once he completed these rounds of gift-giving and niceties, giving his carrots out, Amunhotep brought out the stick. He came to the borderlands of Syria, the regions that were giving him trouble, and swiftly he took action. Quote, "His Majesty reached the region of Edom. He hacked it up in a short moment, like a raging lion, traversing the hills. His Majesty was in his chariot, the chariot named Amun is Brave. The king's face was powerful like Bastet, like Seth in his moment of rage." End quote. Amunhotep II, king of Egypt, was an aggressive ruler. He's demonstrated this before in recent episodes, when he attacks his enemies furiously, almost propelled forward by the force of his will and his desire for victory. In this situation, the king's forward momentum almost caused him a bit of trouble. Moving into Syria, the king was momentarily unaware that enemies had stolen a march and were now preparing to assault him from the rear. Quote, "Then his Majesty crossed the river Orontes on the waters which raged like the god Reshep. Then the king turned back to watch his rearguard. He beheld a few Asiatics creeping behind his lines. They were equipped with weapons of warfare to attack the royal army. His Majesty charged after them like the flight of the divine falcon. He was alone, not a single person was with him except for himself and his brave, strong arm. The Asiatics halted, their hearts weakening, and they fell over one another, fleeing along with their commander. His Majesty overcame them all by shooting." End quote. I love this little escapade. Amunhotep fought a rearguard action against some wily foes, Asiatics who had circumvented his forces and were coming upon the army's rear. The king, supposedly alone, but probably with his bodyguard, attacked these foes head-on. Of course, being the king of Egypt, he routed them, and thereafter Amunhotep listed the booty that he took just from this skirmish. Quote, "List of the booty of his Majesty on this day: 2 foreign chieftains, 6 elite charioteers, the Marianu, also their chariots, their spears, and all of their fighting weapons." End quote. This is a great little anecdote, I think. Probably exaggerated, at least in terms of what the king himself did personally, but I still love it as a sort of sequel to the escapades of Thutmose III back in his campaigns. Amunhotep had a flair for drama, or at least his scribes did, and he tapped into a sort of poetic literary style to capture the excitement of his campaign. Even though the numbers of prisoners are pretty small, just 8, and suggest that this was a minor skirmish, the king still took the time to include it in his war record as a daring tale of danger, pluck, and royal might on the field. Marks for composition? B+. Good work. Amunhotep's army came to Syria and swiftly defeated those who were causing him trouble. This was not a full-scale war, more like a civil disturbance, so the Egyptians didn't seem to have much trouble reasserting their authority. According to the propaganda, the people of different communities came out in peace to their king. They marveled at the Egyptian army as it marched through their lands. Chieftains came out of their towns to give the pharaoh submission and offered their children as hostages, tokens of loyalty to the king of Egypt. Finally, Amunhotep visited cities that had once been enemies, cities like Kadesh, and there he demonstrated his might for them. No one resisted Amunhotep. Syria was utterly at his mercy. Now, we should take these sweeping claims with a grain of salt, As usual, ancient royal texts are about 80% propaganda, even at the best of times. But that being said, Amunhotep did record enough specific details to give Egyptologists a rough sense of the reality which lay behind the proclamations. Aside from the little dramatic moment that I just recounted, the king also included some anecdotes which reveal surprising details. Most importantly, he gives us a sense that this little rebellion, this local crisis, was actually far larger than it first appeared. It seems, or so Amunhotep tells us, that the disturbances in Syria were not entirely local. In at least one or two cases, they were being encouraged by an outsider. Rebellion was not just spontaneous, it was being fomented by a foreign power. Quote, "Now, when His Majesty went south into the valley of Sharon, he captured a messenger belonging to the chief of the land of Naharin. The messenger was carrying a letter sealed with clay around his neck. His Majesty took this man as a prisoner, tying him to the side of his chariot, and marched him back to Egypt." End quote. The messenger came from the land of Naharin. As you know, this was the Egyptian name for the land or kingdom that today we refer to as Mitanni. The chief of Naharin, or Mitanni, was the king of a wide swathe of territory across northern Iraq and Syria. The Mitanni were an Indo-European kingdom of warlords that had been harassing the Syrians and the Egyptians for more than 30 years. A messenger or courier from the king of Mitanni could mean only one thing. The foreign warlords were once again infiltrating Syria and Canaan with their influence. They were almost certainly behind some of these rebellions, sending messengers with promises of aid or reward, if only Syrian cities would consider giving their loyalty to the Mitanni instead of to Egypt. In their classic meddling way, the Mitanni were causing Amunhotep trouble, without ever actually engaging him in a direct war. Despite having taken a Mitanni prisoner, and whatever message the prisoner was carrying, Amunhotep did not use the arrest as an excuse for war. At least, not yet. Instead, the king returned to Egypt with his army. He was satisfied with the current situation, and at home he would be able to resupply, to gather more troops, and to plan something bigger. The next 2 years passed in relative quiet for Amunhotep, but in regnal year 9 the king was ready to return to the battlefield. This time he returned to Syria with a vengeance. The rebellions were over, but the king was only just beginning. In 1435 BCE, regnal year 9, Amunhotep II went to war in Syria once again. This time he was pulling no punches. The Senate board was set, and the king was moving his pieces aggressively. In reality, he was going to practice some of the most brutal military tactics ever recorded in the Egyptian annals. The Year 9 campaign was a landmark, and not necessarily in a good way. The war began, as it always did, with the king on the offensive. Quote, "Year 9, 3rd month of the inundation, day 25. His Majesty proceeded to Syria on his 3rd campaign of victory. His Majesty proceeded first against the town of Afek. The people of Afek came forth in peace on account of the great victories of the Pharaoh, life, prosperity, health. So His Majesty went forth by horse, equipped with weapons of battle, against the towns of Yakma, Mapasin, and Hatasin. He attacked these towns and plundered them. The ruler raged like a divine falcon. His horses flew like a shooting star. His Majesty entered every rebellious town, and its chiefs, its children, and all of its women were brought off as prisoners." End quote. This is where things start to get interesting for Amunhotep's reign. From the very beginning of this campaign, Amunhotep displays a significantly increased level of aggression in how he dealt with his enemies. Going against towns and villages, places so minor that they've never rated mention before, Amunhotep started to attack and plunder everything in his path. Most significantly, Amunhotep II began to take captives on an unprecedented scale. Chieftains, warriors, women, and children, retainers, property, even livestock. The Egyptians rounded up everybody and took them away as their captives. This was the start of a new phase, Amunhotep the captive taker. Quote, His Majesty rested, but the next day he went forth at dawn against the towns of At-Turin and Makhtalain. His Majesty triumphed, like the triumph of Sekhmet, like Montu in Thebes. He took as prisoners their chieftains, 34 of them, their Marianu charioteers, 57, their peasants, living Asiatics, 231. The hands of the slain numbered 372. His Majesty took their horses, 54, and their chariots, 54, in addition to all their weapons of war. He captured all the might of Syria, their children, their women, and all of their property. After His Majesty inspected the takings, great and plentiful, they were all forced to become prisoners. End quote. Until now, I've sold this campaign as an exercise in domination and reaction to rebellion. Amunhotep stamped his authority on Syria as firmly as he could. Looked at from that perspective, this mass prisoner-taking was nothing new, merely an escalation or increase in what had gone before. If kings like Thutmose III had taken away many captives after battle, Amunhotep simply extended that practice to any who dared defy his authority. The fact that he emphasized how many chieftains or charioteers he took in particular should remind us that the pharaoh's priority, first and foremost, was securing his empire against rebellion. If that required a bit of human trafficking, well, what of it? It's the next phase in this campaign that truly begins to bother me. Ever since I first translated this next passage in a graduate hieroglyphs class, a few years ago now, this little episode has dominated my perception of Amunhotep II as a ruler and as a man. Quote, After His Majesty inspected the takings, great and plentiful, they were all forced to become prisoners. Then 2 ditches were dug, with everything pertaining put into them. All of the takings, all of the prisoners were in the ditches. Then one filled the ditches with fire, and His Majesty kept watch over them until dawn. His battle-axe was in his right hand. He was alone, without anyone with him, for the army, and even the royal bodyguard, was far from him when he did this. End quote. Let me repeat that. Amunhotep II, king of Egypt, took 350 or so prisoners, placed them into a ditch, and then set that ditch on fire. He burned the prisoners whole. If we were to describe this in Greek, the word we might use is holocauston. Amunhotep II committed a literal holocaust. Holocaust today has an association with genocide or nuclear Armageddon, but the roots of that word go back to something far more limited in scale. It is a burning by fire of an offering. In the religious sense, a holocaust was an offering to God made through the burning of goods. What else might we call this episode if not a holocaust? The pharaoh took a captive population, subjected them to captivity, and then burned them alive. As he did so, he observed the slaughter, axe in hand, and then he returned to his business. The business of being a son of Amun, the business of being a pharaoh. For my money, this is a dark stain on the reign of Amunhotep II. Few kings before have committed what we might call war crimes. They had led wars, taken prisoners, and engaged in some brutal punishments of those who they perceived to be rebels. But in the surviving records, only Amunhotep went to the kind of extreme lengths that we see here. Whether he is unique or merely the last surviving reference is unclear, but Amunhotep's fiery destruction of his prisoners is about as brutal as Egyptian tactics ever got. Ever since I first translated this text back in my graduate study days, this event has been indelibly stuck in my head whenever I think of Amunhotep II. As far as I'm concerned, it's a defining moment in Egyptian history. Amunhotep's tactics were brutal, but in the nature of ancient politics, war, and diplomacy, he was rewarded for his brutality. Soon after this event, Amenhotep received recognition of his power in the form of tribute and overtures from the world's great powers. His campaign's sudden onslaught against the Syrians, and his extreme tactics in that war, had completely overthrown any designs that other kingdoms may have had on the region. In particular, his campaign seems to have caused that king of Mitanni to rethink his efforts in the region. After the campaign of year 9, a period of peace settles over the Syrian borderland. This was a peace that was going to last more than 10 years. Does this justify Amenhotep's brutal methods? I leave that to you to decide. I suppose we can't deny that it at least had an effect. Quote, "When the chief of Naharin or Mitanni, the chief of Hatti, the Hittites, and the chief of Sanjer, Babylon, heard of the great victory which I had made, each one resembled his neighbor in presenting all kinds of offerings of all foreign lands. They said in their hearts to their divine ancestors to beg peace from his majesty Amunhotep, that the breath of life might be sent to them. They said to the king, 'We are carrying our tribute for your palace, O son of Re, Amunhotep, the god who rules in Heliopolis, ruler of rulers, raging lion in every foreign land, and in our land forever.'" End quote. The victory in year 9 was Amenhotep II's last major campaign. He never needed to take another. As he finished this war, an era of peace was beginning in the Near East. Well, not quite. There were some disturbances down the line, but we'll cover those in the next episode. For now, let's return to Egypt. Amunhotep had captured many prisoners. He had ensured some level of peace in his foreign dominions. Now, it was time to go home. The Egyptian army lifted its spears, gathered together its horde of prisoners, and began to march back to Egypt. This time they would go by land. With a massive train of captives, livestock, and plunder to carry, there was no hope of a seaborne journey. It was a homeward march back to the Nile. For the prisoners in the baggage train, every step was a step away from their homeland and a step towards captivity. When we return, it's time to look at what these captives, these Canaanite and Syrian prisoners, would have experienced in Egypt. Was it brutal subjugation, or merely a recalibration of their lives back home? Did they integrate? How were they treated? In short, what was life like for these new servants, or perhaps slaves, of the Pharaoh? We'll cover that in Chapter 2. Chapter 2. Let me tell you a story. In 1435 BCE, King Amenhotep II and his army returned from a campaign in the Near East. They marched towards Egypt through the harsh light of the Sinai Peninsula. Spears glittered as rank upon rank, battalion after battalion of spearmen marched wearily through the desert landscape. Behind them, thousands of bows were clutched in the hands of the lightly armed archers. Here and there, the heavily armored warriors rode in chariots. Their armor of bronze glinted in the sunlight, a shining symbol of Egyptian might. At the head of this column rode a figure to outstrip them all. Standing tall in his chariot, the conquering pharaoh Amunhotep II, Horus of gold, mighty of strength, the lord who arises in Thebes, returned to the kingdom that he called home. He was a mighty lord indeed. If you needed proof of this, you only needed to look behind him. Amunhotep II had set a new record for brutality in his recent war. Now he set a new record for prisoner-taking. As the Egyptians marched through Sinai, their rear guard was dominated by a veritable horde of bound and captive foreigners. This was a mass of humanity moving against its will towards a new home in the land of Egypt. According to his official records, the captives of the pharaoh numbered almost 100,000 people. Quote, "Regnal year 9. His Majesty returned to the city of Memphis in Egypt. He had vented himself upon every land. All foreign lands were beneath his sandals. The entire army presented the great and abundant plunder without limit. List of the booty which His Majesty brought back. Chieftains of Syria, 127. Their brothers, 179. People of the Aperu, 3,600. People of the Bedouin, 15,200. People from Syria, 36,300. People from the land of Nukashi, 15,070. Their retainers, 30,652. Likewise, for their property without limit, all small cattle which belong to them, all kinds of cattle without limit, chariots of silver and gold, painted chariots of wood, all of their weapons of war, 13,050 items. Total living prisoners of the king, 89,600, through the power of Amun-Re, the noble father whom he loves, who is Amunhotep's protection, and who has ordered bravery for him. End quote. 89,600 living captives. What a number! Add to that 13,000 weapons of war, hundreds of chariots, and untold numbers of cattle, and you have a huge assemblage of booty. All the products, livestock, and people that the lands of Syria could offer had been taken by the Pharaoh. These are numbers that we have not seen even in the days of Egypt's mightiest warrior kings. Even Thutmose III, who fought more than a dozen major campaigns in his reign, did not take these kind of prisoners. These are numbers to dwarf any that a pharaoh has brought back from war at any time before. We should apply some salt to these numbers, of course. 89,000 plus is a bit unbelievable, far beyond anything that any pharaoh had taken over their entire reign. Even if Amenhotep took half as many prisoners as he claimed, he was still uprooting an immense population from its homeland. Imagine trying to manage that many people in one go. Reasonably, it was probably well beyond the average capabilities of the Egyptian army to take that many prisoners at once. Add to that the fact that Amunhotep's campaigns list no major battles or sieges, and it's pretty doubtful that he was even attacking places that had as many people as he claimed here. Even 20,000 captives at the time was more than the population of the largest cities. Assuming Amunhotep attacked many more places than he mentioned, we'll have to assume that the number of captives was, at best, a quarter of what the king claimed. For the sake of argument, let's just say around 20,000. It's more believable, but still a massive number for the time. These 20,000 or so prisoners, men, women, children, and servants, were brought back to Egypt in fetters. Led by spearmen, guarded by archers and charioteers, the people of Canaan and Syria, many of them innocent bystanders, had now become victims of the pharaoh's imperial ambitions. Most of them, just living their lives in small communities, had now found themselves taken away from home, away from their roots. Now they were captives in the land of Egypt. So, who were they? According to Amunhotep's records, the captives included at least 6 different groups. There were 4 major ethnicities or cultures represented. There were the Syrians, the Nukashians from the lands around the Euphrates, the Apiru and Shasu Bedouin, nomadic groups whom we'll discuss later. Within these 4 cultures, there were elite individuals, chieftains, noble families, and charioteers. Also, there were commoners, retainers, and peasants. So from the evidence, this mass deportation was not limited to a particular ethnic group. Instead, the Egyptians had uprooted a whole cross-section of different Near Eastern peoples. They had taken entire communities into bondage. It's rough, but it's a start at getting to some details. The captives were from a broad cross-section of Near Eastern society, but to the Egyptians they were prisoners. For us, the biggest question is, how should we refer to them? Were the prisoners slaves? The ancient Egyptian word for slave doesn't mean slave in the modern sense. The word was hemu, which translated means one who serves. When used for foreigners, it means foreigner who serves. Egyptian servants were distinguished from their foreign counterparts. Egyptians were called baku, which also means servant, but more specifically means Egyptian servant. So the distinction is not an ethnic one, it's a status one, and I'll get to that later in this episode. So the captives were called the Khemu, which in context means foreigner who serves. It sounds appropriate for a slave, right? What else is a slave but someone from outside the community, either by status or by ethnicity, who is made to serve under local masters? Khemu does sound like slave, right? Well, not so fast. Khemu in itself is not a pejorative or negative word. To serve, khem, was a concept that, in ancient Egyptian thought, did not necessarily mean that one was looked down upon. To see this, we only need to look at the fact that the word for priest was Khemu Netcher, literally, servant of the god. Likewise, the phrase His Majesty, meaning the king, was Khemef. So the word for servant, Khemu, and the word for His Majesty, Khemef, were cognate, which tells us that the concept of serving was a bit more complicated than the word slave might imply. For 99% of ancient Egyptians, the best means of gaining favor and advancement in life was to serve one's betters. Egypt was a phenomenally unequal society, with a minuscule upper class, a tiny middle class, and an enormous lower or commoner class. It is easy to forget that in 2017. For the ancients, most people's lives were a matter of serving, far more than a matter of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness. For this reason, many Egyptologists have trouble using the word slave. They prefer to call such servants captive workers. It's a minor change, but it covers a range of differences in how the ancient Egyptians themselves perceived and treated their captives. So, as we move forward, remember that the word slave in the ancient world means something quite different to what we're used to today. With this in mind, I'm going to call the Canaanites Khemu's servants through the rest of this episode. Now you should feel free to substitute slave if you wish, but just remember that the word has a different meaning to the ancient world. Since I'm all about that academic rigor, I'm going with Khemu's servant. The Canaanites were brought to Egypt by the Egyptian army via the land route of the Sinai Peninsula. Whether Amenhotep captured 80,000 or just 20,000 prisoners, there were far too many to take by ship. So, for the bedraggled captives, their route to a new home was by foot, through the unforgiving desert of the Sinai. The soldiers probably did not have the best time of it either. Marching all day, their feet sore and their throats parched, they labored to bring their massive horde of captives safely through the desert, back to home territory. It was a long trek. Perhaps some of the captives died, of illness or accident. Certainly they were drained by long marches, beaten down by the hot sun, and desperate for a glimpse of green. Soon the horizon welcomed them with a faint smudge. Where there had been only blue sky and yellow sand, now there was a blur, a green band spanning the western limits. As they glimpsed this green and realized it was not a mirage, the Egyptians' hearts leapt. Sinai was conquered once again. They had made their way home. The Egyptian army and their thousands of captives emerged from Sinai at the edges of the Nile Delta. Before them, a land of green vegetation and dark waters spread in all directions. The sight was a wonder to behold. For the free Egyptians, what could be sweeter than the sight of home? Passing fortresses and way stations, the army of Pharaoh came to the capital city of the Nile Delta. This was the city called Peru-Nefer, or Good Travels. It was the first stop for the army and its prisoners. For many of the captives, Peru-Nefer was also the last stop. Peru-Nefer would be their new home, the place where they would find themselves working on behalf of the crown. We know a lot about Peru-Nefer in the days of Amunhotep II. Thanks to archaeological work by Austrian archaeologists and a few references in Egyptian texts, we are able to describe the Canaanites' new hometown in quite a bit of detail. Peru-Nefer straddled 2 or 3 branches of the Nile. It was a squat harbour town stretched along the riverbank with docks and jetties protruding into the river. Its horizon was mostly unremarkable, a jumble of houses, a single temple, and a couple of royal palaces used for administration. In the harbour itself, the masts of ships poked up above the trees, from a few sea-going vessels that were tied up in port. Above the skyline, flags waved from flagpoles, silent testament to the power of the Pharaoh, a power which reached into the sky and to the ends of the earth. Symbolism aside, the captives would also have been greeted by a sight quite similar to those of home. The delta outside of Peru-Nefer was filled with orchards, with vineyards, and with cattle grazing farmland. In fact, apart from the wetter soil and marshes, the delta was mostly not so distinguishable from what they had experienced back home. Peru-Nefer and the region around it was governed at this time by a man named Ken-Amun. Ken-Amun, or one who accomplishes for Amun, lived in the city of Peru-Nefer as the king's chief steward, the Imira Perwer en Nesut. This was a prestigious title, giving Ken-Amun responsibility for many things. He comes into our story as the chief overseer of Peru-Nefer's economic institutions, in particular its laborers, its farmers, its cattle herders, and its builders. As you can guess, this makes Ken-Amun pretty useful for understanding the larger tale of the Canaanite captivity. Ken-Amun's responsibilities were particularly focused on the rearing and raising of cattle. Among his many titles are the jobs of Overseer of Cattle of the Sovereign and Overseer of the Cattle of Amun. Basically, any livestock which belonged to the royal household, or the temples which were owned by the royal household, Ken-Amun oversaw. So when the army of Egypt returned with its 20,000 plus Canaanite captives and its cattle without limit, Ken-Amun probably saw the horde and thought, I bet I wind up dealing with that. The delta was a center for cattle ranching in ancient Egypt. It was the only part of the country with enough space to host the massive herds and the abundance of water necessary to provide for them. Since the earliest days of the kingdom, even back in the age of the pyramids, the Egyptians were focusing their ranching and cattle rearing on the edges of the Nile Delta. There were grasslands and open spaces. There, the livestock of the Canaanites would find a good home. Accordingly, many of the Canaanites, particularly those who had been pastoralists or livestock herders back home, were probably sent to the cattle ranches in the Nile Delta. After all, why retrain someone when you can just make them do the same work they were already doing? The Egyptians had taken on a huge number of cattle. They might as well use the people who were experienced with them. So, many thousands of livestock moved into the Nile Delta. Along with them went probably several hundred Canaanites, making their new home with their old animals. For many of the captives entering the Delta, this new land must have seemed visually amazing. The Nile Delta was unbelievably wet and fertile compared to the hinterlands of Canaan or Syria. The new population would have been understandably astounded at the lush greenery and abundant waterways of the Delta, at the fish which teemed in every river, at the orchards, farms, and vineyards which filled the spaces. Compared to their homelands, the Nile Delta was incredible. This isn't to suggest that Syria and Canaan were desolate backwaters, of course, far from it. But compared to most places between Sinai and the Black Sea, the Nile Delta had a level of fertility that was ludicrously good for the day. No matter where you were from, visiting northern Egypt for the first time must have seemed like a paradise of greenery and growth. Maybe, to some of the prisoners, this captivity didn't seem like such a bad prospect after all. Well, not so fast. According to records from the time of Tutankhamun, about 130 years later, captives of the Egyptian army were not necessarily treated that well. Images from the tomb of a general, Horemheb, shows overseers from the army brandishing sticks above captive Nubians and Asiatics. The overseers beat their charges and asserted their dominance aggressively. So given what we've learned about the tactics of Amunhotep II, it's probably fair to say that some of the new captives, especially the warriors taken in battle, were victims of this treatment. Likewise, anyone who resisted being placed into new jobs probably got a taste of the stick. So, we should acknowledge that off the bat. The captives' first experience of Egyptian hospitality was not, probably, a nice one. As the Egyptian soldiers shepherded their captives into Peru-Nefer, the new servants were assessed by scribes. Men and women were noted for their jobs back home, and then directed towards work which suited their experience. Considering that the economies of Syria and Egypt were not so different, the basic industries were pretty transferable. So Syrian Canaanite captives found themselves shipped off to production centres suited to what they had done in their homeland. The main jobs for these servants took place in the fields and in the temple workshops. In the fields, they worked as winemakers, cattle herders, field hands, and farmers. In the temples, they were put to work making weapons for the army, jewellery for the wealthy, ornaments for the temples, and construction items like bricks for masonry. All up, the Khemu servants were put into the very jobs that many of them probably held back in Syria. Some of them were even valued for their skills. For example, Syrian Canaanites were highly prized in the matter of producing wine. In a tomb at Thebes, a wealthy priest named Ka-Imwaset had his sepulchre decorated with a scene of life in the Nile Delta. The scene depicts, on the top layer, a group of men and a young boy working under the vines and leaves of an Egyptian vineyard. They are kneeling except for the boy, while overhead, long vines bend in a sort of arch. The leaves of the vines are a dark green, and they droop down, while in between, small bunches of dark grapes hang ready to be picked. The workers pluck the bunches of grapes from the vines, store them in wicker baskets, and one of them pours water into the soil to help the vines grow fruitful. It's a charming little scene, pictures at the website, but it tells us a surprising amount about the life of foreigners working under Egyptian rule. There are 6 workers in this vineyard. Of the 6, only 2, a man and the boy, are native Egyptians. The other 4 are Nubian, Syrian, and a man from Mitanni. How do we know this? Well, the Nubian is easy. He's black, and he has the stylized facial features that the Egyptians used to show sub-Saharan Africans in their art. The Syrian and the Mitanni, though, those are distinguished by their hair. The Syrians, 2 of them, wear their hair slightly long on the back, but with the front of their head shaved. Their hair hangs down in little strands at the back, giving it a distinct ringlet appearance that you don't see with native Egyptians. Furthermore, they have small pointed beards, symbols of the Near Easterner, for as long as Egyptians were depicting them. The man from Mitanni is another matter. In truth, I should call him Hurrian, since Hurrian is the cultural ethnic language group which made up most of the kingdom of Mitanni's population. I refer to him as Mitanni only to connect him with the political situation, but truthfully, he is clearly an Indo-European Hurrian. How do we know? Well, the Hurrian man is blonde. In a rare feature of Egyptian art, the blonde hair of the Hurrian Mitanni male stands out in sharp contrast to everyone else. The Egyptians, Nubians, and Syrians are all black-haired or brunette. You know, the common colors of Egyptian hair. But not this guy. He is a full-on Indo-European, to the point that even his skin is a lighter shade of brown than everyone else. So it seems like whoever painted this scene was aware of what a Hurrian Mitanni man looked like, which either means that the scene was based on a real observation, or on a set of new artistic details that had filtered into the Egyptian cultural scene. Simply put, this is amazing. On the next register down, below this motley group of grape pickers, another gang of mixed-race workers are involved in the production of wine. This time, a group of 6 men stand in rows facing each other. They are standing in a large mud brick basin, and above them hangs a wooden pole held up by 2 staves. The men are pressing the grapes with their feet, standing in rank and stomping the juice out of their comrades' harvest. It is the second phase in the wine production process, and like the first scene, the workers are a combination of black Nubian, brown Egyptian, and blonde Hurrian. At least 4 of the 6 are blonde, suggesting that the job of wine pressing was, at least here, handed over to the foreigners. The Egyptians genuinely appreciated the work done by Canaanites, Syrians, and Indo-Europeans in the matter of winemaking. From the very start of the New Kingdom, right down to its end, different references suggest that the upper crust of Egypt favored Syrian Canaanite wine products as their drink of choice. In fact, from this moment in their history forward, we will start to see more and more Egyptian sites turning up storerooms filled with jars and amphorae of wine. The kings of Egypt began to pay attention to vintages and locations, and prized some above others. They also looked to protect certain territories in their empire, simply because those locations were good for wine production. Eventually, the Egyptians would even start to send Syrian and Canaanite prisoners on colony missions down to Nubia to set up new vineyards. Basically, from about 1450 BCE, and especially from the time of Amunhotep II, the ancient Egyptians began to invest heavily in the business of winemaking. Who was doing the work? Why, the Syrian Canaanites, of course. They were working alongside Egyptian laborers and overseen by Egyptian foremen. They were the driving force of a new Egyptian wine industry. Loire Valley, eat your heart out. The tomb of Ka-em-Waset, where that scene appears, is not the only tomb of this era to show such imagery. In the famous tomb of Nakht, which is undated but roughly contemporary with Ka-em-Waset, another scene of wine production appears. Here, it is a similar story as in the other tomb. Men of different races, blonde-haired, black-haired, curly, straight, work beneath an arbor of vines, grapes hanging down plump and ready to pick. The men collect the bunches in baskets and then take them to the pressing vat, where another 6 men stand side by side pressing the grapes with their feet. Between the two groups, a collection of wine jars stands ready for filling. Scenes like this, wherever they appear, are some of my favorite scenes of daily life. I personally love wine. I have a glass with me right now. And I particularly love learning how drinks of all kinds are made and come down to us. Plus, I love the idea of sipping a glass of wine or beer and know that I'm sharing something which is fundamentally the same as what people were drinking 3,500 years ago. It's so cool! Anyway, these winemakers, Egyptian and foreign, tend to appear in scenes under the supervision of wealthier Egyptian males. In the tomb of Ka-em-Waset, the workers are supervised by a tall man wearing a high-quality, translucent linen robe. He is an Egyptian of high rank, and he holds aloft a drinking cup with a small wine pourer. From the pourer, he upends a stream of wine into his cup. Before him, piles of food, bread, meat, grapes from the vineyard are stacked high. The Egyptian noble stands in front of an altar, which is in the shape of the Ka symbol, a pair of arms raised upward at the elbow, and a statue in the shape of a cobra. This cobra is the goddess Wadjet. Wadjet is one of the Nebeti, or 2 ladies, who were the patron goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt. Wadjet, the cobra, was the patron of Lower Egypt. And so, from this little worship detail, we can establish that the vineyard was located in the Nile Delta. Although the tomb in question was built at Thebes in Upper Egypt, the statue of Wadjet and the scenery around the nobleman tells us that these vineyards and all of this activity were taking place in the north. The north of the country was not just wine country, of course. Since time immemorial, the Nile Delta had been the Egyptians' wild frontier for resources. It was a land of vast cattle ranches, thickets of flax, and hundreds on hundreds of sources for fishing. The Hemu servants, the Canaanite and Syrian captives, were put to work throughout the delta on a variety of tasks. Apart from wineries, the Hemu servants from Canaan and Syria were put to work in 3 major industries. They were masons, making bricks and erecting buildings for the Egyptian state. They were craftsmen, forging weapons, temple ornaments, and jewelry for the splendor of the pharaoh and the wealthy. And they were farmers, raising cattle and ploughing fields in order to feed the boundless appetite of the royal household. In short, they were assigned to the sort of jobs that were necessary, fundamental to the Egyptian state, but which Egyptians themselves might rather not have done. Working in wineries, in farmland, and in manual labour was hardly what you would call easy work. The Egyptians knew that very well, and in one of their older texts, a scribe had savagely mocked the manual labour professions. In the famous Satire of the Trades from the Middle Kingdom, a scribe named Keti had characterized builders, farmers, and craftsmen as the epitome of hard-done-by, poor wretches who worked to exhaustion. For the Canaanite Chemu servants, this was probably a reasonably accurate description. Quote,
I do not see a stoneworker on an important errand, or a goldsmith in a place to which he has been sent, but I have seen a coppersmith at his work at the mouth of his furnace. His fingers were like the claws of a crocodile, and he stank more than fish eggs. The arrow maker goes north to the delta to fetch himself arrows. He must work excessively in his activity. When the gnats sting him, and the sand fleas bite him as well, then he is judged. I shall also describe to you the life of a bricklayer. His kidneys are painful, his work pains him. When he must be outside in the winds, he lays bricks without a loincloth. His belt is a cord for his back, a string for his buttocks. His strength has vanished through fatigue and stiffness, kneading all his excrement. He eats bread with his fingers, although he washes himself but once a day.
End quote. This text was composed in the 12th dynasty, around 1900 BCE, but its words and its sentiments could easily be transplanted to the New Kingdom. Technology had not shifted that much in the centuries, and the life of the Canaanite Chemu was probably quite similar to the Middle Kingdom labourer. In fact, this text, called the Teaching of Keti, or the Satire of the Trades, was still popular among scribes during the 18th dynasty. Writers, particularly students learning their hieroglyphs, copied the teaching in order to learn their letters, and to gain an appreciation of what their new job had spared them in the way of work. The Canaanite Syrian Chemu had been put to work as craftsmen in the temples, particularly weapon makers, whom the scribe characterizes as being judged or at the mercy of gnats and sand fleas. In addition, the Middle Kingdom scribe had a bit of scorn for one of the jobs which the Canaanites were so good at. He heaped his distaste on those who produced wine in the royal vineyards. Quote,
Behold, the winemaker hauls his shoulder yoke. Each of his shoulders is burdened with age. A swelling is on his neck, and it festers. He spends the morning in watering leeks, and the evening with corianders, after he has spent midday in the palm grove. So it happens that he sinks down at last and dies through his deliveries more than one of any other profession.
End quote. So, revisiting this old text, which I first looked at back in episode 48, I think we can appreciate a bit better the lot of the Canaanite Syrian workers who lived in Egypt. Not only were they there by force, but the daily tasks that they were put to were a brutal mix of exhaustion, endless hours, and physical discomfort. I could go on at length about the different kinds of work done by these captives and their Egyptian colleagues, but if I did, I would wind up describing the entire Delta economy in one episode. So, to avoid that, let's move on. I now want to turn to one last artistic scene, a little vignette that might be one of my favourite cartoon images from ancient Egypt. This is a remarkable vignette in an Egyptian tomb that gives us a sense of the relationship between captive and master, between Egyptian and foreigner. The scene in question comes from the tomb of Pa-Heri, a wealthy nobleman who recorded some beautiful scenes in his tomb. Pa-Heri was a wealthy man. Naturally, he was also the master of a number of foreign workers, and they appeared in his tomb doing the sort of activities that I've described. In one scene in particular, two of Pa-Heri's Chemu servants work in the flax marshes. The men are Syrian or Canaanite, probably prisoners taken in the reign of Thutmose I. They wear distinctive kilts and cloth caps on their long hair. They have a small curl at the brow. The two men work to flatten piles of flax into bundles and then tie them up tightly for transportation. Every now and again, an Egyptian man brings these two workers a new pile of flax for them to tie up. Now, it's not the scene itself that I love, it's the hieroglyphs that go along with it. In a great little caption above this scene, one of the Syrians says to the Egyptian, "If you can bring me 11,000 sacks of flax, I am the one who will comb them." In other words, the Syrian brags to the Egyptian, "Bring me as much work as you can. I'll tackle it all, and I'll get it done." It's an amusing moment of boasting. But the Egyptian boy slaps him down. He says, "Hurry up! Don't talk so much, you old, balding farmhand." Relationships, it seems, were strained. Hard workers they may have been, but the Khemu servants still suffered from an element of snobbery from their masters. The curious thing is, the Egyptian insults his colleague on the basis of occupation and age rather than ethnicity, which should tell you something of the Egyptian attitude. It was better to be Egyptian than foreign, but even more importantly, it was better to be in charge than in service. Paheri, or the artist working for him, captured this element beautifully in a simple but evocative scene. Looking at it today, we can say that the life of the Canaanite field hand was not the most glamorous. Even the best workers were hassled daily. Of course, we might have misinterpreted that whole scene. There's a good chance the Egyptian was teasing his colleague. Calling your boastful comrade old and balding is pretty harmless when you think about it. Maybe the jibe was humorous. It wouldn't be the first time a moment of humor has been lost in translation. I sometimes think of a Sudanese man that I worked with at the site of Jebel Barkal in 2014. This chap was a braggart, a bit of a big talker, you know the sort. Likes to think he's the best and tells everyone that he is. Well, naturally, we got into some spirited competition, and it wasn't long before I was calling him Omar Majnun, or Crazy Omar, and he was calling me Dominic Balid, or Stupid Dominic. It was all good fun, and every time we jabbed at each other, our team thought it was hilarious. But if I wrote that down in cold, colourless writing and put it on a wall, would an archaeologist be able to distinguish our hassling from something more aggressive? I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that there is a lot of nuance in the relationship between Canaanite and Syrian Khemu, captives or slaves, and their masters, compared with what we get from other narratives. We've now covered some of the major artistic references to foreign workers, or slaves, that we get from Egypt. I could describe every scene that foreigners appear in, but as I've said, that would wind up describing a lot of the Egyptian economy. So, those are the artistic scenes. But what does the soil itself tell us? If Canaanites were in Egypt in large numbers, they would leave material remains, right? Well, yes they did. The Canaanites living in Egypt have left a few traces of their physical presence. Items like pieces of clothing and adornment in particular help us to see where Canaanites were living according to their traditional means. Different tools also help us see when the foreigners were adapting to their new home, but retaining some of their exotic skills. One of the easiest way to tell the foreigners apart is the items of clothing that they wore. Canaanite burials and domestic remains show that the foreigners were using a variety of non-Egyptian decorative items in their day-to-day life. Now these could be as simple as earrings, which the Egyptians did not actually use until the 18th dynasty, but could also include various other things as well. Canaanite relics include small clothing pins, which they used to fasten their clothing together, ivory combs, which they made in a distinct style, and metal bands, which we call torques, kind of like a large bangle or bracelet, but usually worn around the neck. Items like these have been found in different sites at Egypt, and they don't tend to occur in Egyptian tombs or settlements. This suggests that the Canaanites were living together in particular neighborhoods, and in many ways were holding on to their traditional styles of dress. There are also traces of the foreigners' eating habits. Where archaeologists find little clumps or clusters of foreign objects, they are able to detect the presence of non-Egyptians in the archaeological record. Sometimes, these objects can be cooking utensils of a certain kind, or even spices. Canaanite trade and movement brought a variety of new spices and flavors to Egypt. They brought new items like black cumin and safflower, which they used to extract vegetable oil and clothing dye. Sometimes even their eating tools are a giveaway. Canaanites, or people from the Near East, often liked to use drinking straws with their beer. The drinking straw had been invented in Mesopotamia, and it was a hollow reed that was sucked through in order to filter the pulp out of ancient beer. Well, foreigners seem to have brought the drinking straw to Egypt because it shows up in some artistic records. Curiously, the straw almost always appears in the hands of foreigners only. The Egyptians did not pick up on it. We're not sure why, maybe they didn't think it was necessary, but the Egyptians took one look at the drinking straw and simply shrugged. They didn't need it. So when the straw shows up, it gives us hints of the foreigners and their eating habits in the Nile Valley. The best evidence for foreigners at work in Egypt comes from the industrial areas. As part of their captivity, Canaanites and Syrians were put to work in the production centers and workshops which were owned by the king and by the temples. We've seen some of these already, laboring to produce wine for the crown. Well, there were others too. Canaanites were big producers of things like clothing and metalwork. They had distinctive styles and methods of weaving, spinning, and smelting, and those show up in the soil. For example, Canaanites used a particular type of metal weight for measuring and weighing objects. Canaanite weavers used distinct spindles, and according to the artwork, their nicer clothing always looked different from that of the Egyptians. Finally, the Egyptians themselves recognized the distinct habits of the Canaanite weavers. Egyptians called foreign cloth da'iyu amu, or Asiatic cloth. So the Canaanites that Amunhotep II brought back were certainly valued in some of the more fundamental industries. Finally, there were people like woodworkers and carvers who give us a hint of Canaanites living and working in Egypt. Most wooden items, particularly in the Delta, have decayed too far to survive, but a few pieces hint at the Canaanites living and working in Egypt and applying their unique cultural styles to Egyptian products. There are wooden bowls in Egypt from this period that are almost copies of items that are found in Jericho in modern Israel. So probably there were a few Canaanite woodworkers in Egypt during this period. It's not hard to imagine Amunhotep II picking the sort of workers he wanted back at home and plucking them out of their communities in Canaan. Those are the workers and their archaeological records of the Canaanites and Syrians in Egypt. Captives of the Pharaoh, they had been resettled by force in a new land. Once there, they found a way to produce items in their own style, and in their dress and food they retained a sense of home. We now come to the end of Chapter 2. Looking back, we've covered a lot of material, but it is possible to summarize that into something more bite-sized. Long story short, the Canaanite Syrians came to Egypt as prisoners, but they soon found their lives progressing in a way that was, probably, quite similar to what they had experienced at home. Their jobs remained essentially the same, and although work in Egypt was tough, it was probably not too different from work elsewhere in the Bronze Age world. That is to say, life was tough for most of the human population. In Chapter 3, I look at two major concepts. One, the social status and rank of the Canaanite Chemu servants, if any, and two, the evidence for the so-called captivity, the biblical enslavement in Egypt. Where does this story come from? Let's find out. Chapter 3, The Captivity. Welcome back. So far in this episode, we have seen the historical context in which slavery, quote-unquote, really kicked into high gear in Egypt. We've also seen the expression of that process in art and archaeology. In the reign of Amunhotep II, around 1435 BCE, the Pharaoh of Egypt began a policy of depopulating huge regions of Syria and Canaan. He and his soldiers gathered up families, men, women, children, and servants, from territories that were considered unstable or rebellious. They then marched these captives back to Egypt in the thousands. In the Nile Valley, the Canaanites and Syrians of different cultural groups came to be known as the Khemu. This word is sometimes translated as slave, but I think the reality is more nuanced. So I've been using the term Khemu servants, since that is what Khemu literally translates to, servants. The Canaanite Khemu formed a new breed of worker in Egypt. They filled the fields, the workshops, the cattle ranches, and the vineyards with foreign expertise. They labored under the watchful eye of Egyptian masters, and they lived a life that was, in practical terms, very similar to their old one. But in terms of dignity or status, there is good reason to think that many Khemu's servants were living in a new world altogether. That being said, they weren't always stuck in one position. First of all, we should make note of the fact that Egyptian society, like most ancient societies, was incredibly hierarchical. Status and one's prestige or rank were of the utmost importance to the ancient Egyptians, far more important than one's material wealth. Looked at from this perspective, the line between slave and peasant immediately becomes harder to determine. A peasant worker and a quote-unquote slave might have roughly similar levels of material wealth, but depending on the person's connections or social status within their community, the line between who was higher and who was lower could change, especially over the course of a few generations. Around the time of Amunhotep II, approximately 1435 BCE, a man emerges in the Egyptian record who is quite remarkable in his circumstances. This man's name was Pa-Heka-Men. Pa-Heka-Men, or the ruler endures, was a man who worked in the Egyptian government, and who held a few important offices in the city of Thebes. He lived under the rule of the Pharaoh, he served under the Pharaoh, and when he died, he was given the lavish tomb appropriate to a great servant of Pharaoh. Pa-Heka-Men was a lucky man who managed to establish himself in prosperity and good standing. The thing is, Pa-Heka-Men was not Egyptian. He was actually a Canaanite, and his true name was not Pa-Heka-Men. His true name was Benya. Benya lived in Egypt at the time of Amunhotep II. Whether he was born in Egypt or came from Canaan is unknown. Benya himself was reticent on the details of his origins. What is clear is that he was, at best, a second-generation immigrant. Benya's parents were almost certainly foreign. His father had the Hurrian name El-Taunana, and his mother had the Mitanni name Tirukak. So Benya, either born in Egypt or in Syria, was the child of an East Syrian line, Euphrates region Hurrian descendant, a scion of the land of Mitanni. You know, that land that the king had just spent 4 months butting heads with in a proxy war. The fact that Benya is of Hurrian descent is fundamental to our understanding of the quote-unquote Hebrew question of ancient Egypt. Broadly speaking, it is now understood that the semi-legendary Abraham, the first leader of the followers of the god Jehovah, was probably a man from the land of Mitanni. He originated in the upper Euphrates region and later travelled through the Near East and Egypt before settling and dying in Canaan. The legendary Abraham was most likely a man of Hurrian origin. So if we are thinking that the biblical Hebrews were the descendants or followers of Abraham, the appearance of Hurrians in Egypt, both in the vineyards in chapter 2 and Benya's parents here, is quite revealing. I should stress that I am no biblical scholar, but this is an interesting idea. Benya's name is also interesting in itself. The term Ben means son of. The word Benya might possibly be a reference to son of Yah, aka son of Yahweh. Now that's unproven, but if it's the case, it would make Benya the first and one of the only references to the divine name Yahweh, aka Jehovah, or the God of Abraham, in ancient Egypt. I have to stress that that reading is very speculative, totally unproven, but it's a notable possibility, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it. Benya comes to prominence in adulthood, and he makes very little reference to his background. All he tells us is that he was a Gered en Kap, or child of the royal nursery, which tells us that Benya grew up in the Egyptian palace, either among the nobility or the royal children. Now that could mean that he was born in Egypt and that his parents were nobility from his own land, or that he was born outside of Egypt and brought to the palace as a political hostage at a young age. Either one is possible, and Amunhotep II specifically says in his war records, quote, "His Majesty entered a community, and its chiefs, its children, and its women were brought off as prisoners. Children of chieftains captured, 232 male and 323 female." End quote. The pharaoh was in the business of child hostages, or at least of uprooting whole families rather than just the men. So Benya came to the royal court, somehow, in Egypt. He soon acquired an Egyptian name to go along with his Canaanite one. He was called Pa-Heka-Men, or the ruler endures. And this is kind of what you'd expect from a foreigner who's been brought to a new palace. It's a sycophantic name, celebrating the Egyptian king. And so, it was a constant affirmation that Benya, the foreigner, was a loyal member of the court. But Benya never let go, or was never allowed to forget, his foreign origins. Almost every time his name is recorded, it is described as Pa-Heka-Men, who is called Benya. No matter where he went, or whom he spoke to, Benya was always known as a man of two worlds, a dual citizen in a new imperial regime. Benya lived far away from the delta where many of his countrymen were based. Instead, Benya lived in the south at the city of Thebes. Here he became a member of the government bureaucracy, working in the temples of Thebes on behalf of the pharaoh. Benya attained the titles Overseer of Craftsmen of the Lord of the Two Lands and Overseer of Construction Works at Karnak. This would have put him in charge of labourers and artisans working in the Theban region. In other words, there's a good chance that he wound up overseeing many workers who, ethnically, were his compatriots. If they looked to him for any special favour, though, I imagine they were disappointed. Benya was scrupulously Egyptian in his habits. He dressed Egyptian, spoke and wrote Egyptian, lived in an Egyptian style, and worshipped Egyptian gods. So although his name might mean son of Yahweh, for all intents and purposes, Benya, the overseer of craftsmen, was really a son of Ptah. Benya was what we might call middle class in Egyptian society. Although he had connections and clearly attained status and wealth to afford a nice tomb, he never rose to the most prestigious ranks of the court. Realistically, there's a good chance that there was still something of a glass ceiling in the Egyptian court. Benya might have been a loyal servant and rewarded for his loyalty with noble rank, but the highest offices were still the domain of the Egyptian elite. Only a tiny group of people, like the vizier Rek-mi-Re, heir to multiple viziers in just one family, could access the top ranks of the court. But it wouldn't be that way forever. When we return to the subject of the Canaanites and the Exodus in a much later episode, we will see Canaanites rising to some of the highest ranks in Egyptian society. One day, even people like the vizier Rek-mi-Re will have to give their position up to newcomers like Benya's people of Canaan and Syria. Speaking of Rek-mi-Re, whom we met last episode, Benya most likely reported to the vizier personally on a regular basis. According to the other titles in his tomb, Benya also achieved the rank of Overseer of the Seal Bearers. This was a kind of elite secretary role, taking responsibility for sending government messages and decrees and attaching the royal seal to them. It was also a job that reported directly to the vizier once every month. It was Benya's job as overseer of the seal bearers to inform the highest official of the palace's finances, of how the estate of the king was doing in an economic sense. Benya, in effect, was a delegate of the vizier Rek-mi-Re. He was a non-Egyptian servant serving one of the highest officials in the land. Not bad for a son of Mitanni. So, Benya, the son of Asia, did very well for himself. Was his story typical? Not at all. Quite the opposite. Benya was one of a tiny group who were lucky enough to escape the drudgery of common menial labor. Still, credit where credit is due. Benya the Canaanite achieved something that not many did. Benya's story might remind you of the biblical Joseph, the son of Jacob and Rachel, who was sold into slavery in Egypt, but then rose to the highest political offices in the land. Joseph, who supposedly became vizier of Egypt, was one of the first quote-unquote Hebrews in Egypt. It was his example, the example of a foreigner who could rise to great heights, that encouraged many Hebrews to settle in the land of the Nile. But who were the Hebrews around 1435 BCE? Did they exist as a distinct people yet? What were their origins? Scholars have not reached a consensus on where the Hebrews come from. For starters, the term Hebrew is more of a collective term than an ethnic designation. Hebrew covers a whole range of different subgroups, of which one, the biblical Israelites, are actually just one. So it's hard to figure out who the original Hebrews really were, and there are quite a few candidates. But from our perspective, that's actually not so bad, because two of the main candidates show up in the prisoner records of King Amunhotep II. The top candidates for the precursors to the Hebrews are a group called the Apiru. The Apiru, or dusty ones, come from Canaan, Syria, the Euphrates, basically everywhere in the Near East. They're not a single ethnic group. Rather, Apiru may be considered the vagabonds of Bronze Age Canaan and Syria. They were the people who travelled the roads and hinterland, hence the term dusty, and were generally nomadic. They were considered outcasts and were looked down upon as either vagabonds or servile or both. Either way, local elites didn't like them much. The pharaoh Amunhotep II brought back 3,600 Apiru at the end of his campaign in regnal year 9. A sizable population which he had probably gathered from the rural communities all over Canaan and Syria. The Apiru, unlike the Canaanites, disappeared into the firmament and were never seen in Egyptian art. This would go along with their, quote, servile status. Apiru had so little prestige or social influence that they simply didn't rate an appearance among more noteworthy groups. Which sounds pretty fitting for biblical slaves, right? The Apiru remain mysterious, precisely because they were on the fringes of organized society. The people who produced written records and artistic imagery took little concern for fringe dwellers, except when they were able to exert some kind of political influence. As you can imagine, that was pretty hard for the Apiru to do. If you weren't in the social club, how could you participate in its mechanisms? About 120 years after the days of Amunhotep II, a long time in their lives, but just a blip in history, the Apiru later figured out a way to have some sort of political influence. How did they do it? Why, by force, of course. Quote, "And now the two sons of Labayu are giving their money to the Apiru and to the men of Cush to make war against me. A letter from Biridiah of Megiddo to the Pharaoh Akhenaten." End quote. In a diplomatic letter written decades after Amunhotep II, the Apiru appear as warriors for hire, willing to aid the princes of Canaan in their struggles against one another. Now there's a whole episode wrapped up in just that one little quote, and I will explore it at the appropriate time. The point is that the Apiru, who may be cultural relatives of the Hebrews, appear in the days of Amunhotep II and his successors as a kind of peripheral group, looked down upon, even despised, but still capable of exerting some influence over their own destiny. So the Apiru are a pretty attractive contender for being one of the original Hebrews of the Bible. Apiru appearing in the reign of Amunhotep II have captives numbering in the thousands, and this would give some explanation as to why, in the Bible, the Hebrews were said to have come to Egypt and there been subjugated by the rulers. Now obviously, fact and fiction still have plenty of gaps between them, but hey, this is a start, right? The second cultural group that might be related to the biblical Hebrews are one that we have met many times. They appear throughout Egyptian history and came to Egypt again in the reign of Amunhotep II. Quote, "List of the booty which His Majesty brought back. Chieftains of Syria, 127. Apiru, 3,600. Shasu Bedouin, 15,200. End quote. The Shasu Bedouin. Like the Apiru, they were fringe dwellers. Unlike the Apiru, they were known to the ancient Egyptians since the early days of the Pharaonic kingdom. They show up on the fringes of society, and one of Egyptology's more noteworthy intellectuals, the late Hans Gerdeker, suggested that they might be described like this. Quote, "The consistent main feature of the Shasu Bedouin is the life in the desert. Connected with it is the unlimited desire for freedom and the horror of any restriction. The Bedouin's livelihood comes not from agriculture, but rather from cattle. The Shasu Bedouin is akin to a hunter of the desert, a social or ethnic class that should be contrasted with the sedentary farmer." End quote. So the Shasu Bedouin were similar to the Apiru. They were mobile peoples, fringe dwellers, whom the sedentary farmers of the Nile Valley and of Canaan in Syria found to be distasteful. Basically, they were outsiders, in the social and the geographical sense. They had no social power, no connections, and no institutions. As such, they were fair game for rulers like Amunhotep II to take advantage of. In a text from Nubia, Amunhotep II called himself the Hu Shasu, or Smiter of the Shasu. This is a fitting epithet for the king, given that in Chapter 1 of this episode, we witnessed Amunhotep slaughtering an entire community of Syrian Canaanites, just because he could. Amunhotep trumpeted his military power and the terror of his name at every opportunity. So the Shasu probably had a very negative view of this king, and their time in Egyptian captivity probably reinforced that. I mentioned earlier how Egyptians assessed people's worth based more on hierarchy than ethnicity. Well, that affected the Shasu Bedouin as well. While the Assyrians and Canaanites were useful and found their way into employment or even government office at times, the Shasu Bedouin arrived in Egypt as prisoners and then disappeared. They are almost entirely absent from the written documents and from the archaeological record. Why? There are 3 reasons to that. Firstly, it's hard to find nomads in the archaeological record unless you know what you're looking for and where to look for it. Secondly, we don't know what we're looking for. The Egyptians do not describe the Shasu in any kind of details or specifics that would help archaeologists point to an object and say, this may be Shasu in origin. Third, and finally, the very nature of the Shasu themselves made them particularly prone to disappearing. Egyptian artists were good at distinguishing between different cultures or ethnicities. Nubians, Libyans, Syrians, Hittites, Hurrians, even Minoans, all of these people and more were depicted with distinct styles of clothing, of personal adornment and physical characteristics. But the Shasu, well, they're not distinct. In fact, we're not even sure if the depictions of Shasu actually are Shasu, or just generic foreigner number 372. The Egyptian artists cared so little about the Bedouin, thought so little of their culture, or lack of it, that they either didn't bother to depict them, or didn't know how to depict them in a unique way. Basically, the Shasu Bedouin were culturally invisible. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the Shasu Bedouin, inherent wanderers of no fixed abode or region, did not form any cultural stereotypes of their own. So when they came to Egypt and were forced to settle into the permanent lifestyle of the Nile dwellers, they simply disappeared into the culture. It all comes down to the idea of assimilation, which is epitomized by that Canaanite official, Benya, whom we met earlier. As the Egyptians brought foreigners in, by force, some of them became assimilated into the Egyptian culture. As they did so, their foreignness began to disappear, and their culture became one with the Egyptians. The Shasu arrived in Egypt and then disappeared. It's hard to imagine them preserving a unique identity in a way that might produce the account of the Hebrew Exodus. But the Shasu's nomadism and the Aperu's wandering are two pieces of the same puzzle. At the end of the day, the biblical captivity has its roots in a time when Egyptians, who were river-dwelling, farming, and estate-building, sought to force others, nomads, fringe dwellers, and wanderers, to work for them, to build their way of life, and to strengthen their royal state. If the days of Amunhotep II and the foreign workers who show up in this period tell us anything, it's that the captivity of foreigners was the start of a new phase in Egyptian history. As we will see moving forward, that phase was going to have massive repercussions. We now come to the end of this episode. It's been a massive one, the longest yet. We've seen the wars led by Amunhotep II, wars which devastated regions and plucked entire communities out of their homes for a forced resettlement in Egypt. These captives arrived in the tens of thousands. Unwilling and afraid, they came to Egypt and found themselves working for the state. The mastery of Egypt was total in 1435 BCE. Archaeology Amunhotep II, the Golden Horus, was ruler of all that he surveyed. He had mastered the foreign lands and displayed a level of brutality, of terror tactics that would ensure obedience to Egyptian rule. His diplomatic influence, too, was at its peak, with the kings of Mitanni, Babylon, and the Hittites sending him gifts of friendship. As the king settled into his second decade on the throne, the power he wielded was beyond measure. The captives who came to Egypt under Amunhotep II found themselves working in the industries that they had performed at home. Canaanites and Syrians, Bedouin and Aperu spread throughout the Egyptian delta. They worked as craftsmen, as metal workers, as builders and as farmers. They pastured cattle, they cultivated vines. They lived and worked as they had done for generations. But now, the eyes of the Egyptian elites were always upon them. The Egyptian nobility revelled in the power of their culture, the mastery which they held over the world around them. They enjoyed wine produced by foreign hands. They wore jewellery and cloth produced in Canaanite styles. When it came time to decorate their tombs, they filled the walls with scenes of those workers in their care. Egyptian peasants, Canaanite peasants. It didn't matter. The elites were proud of their power, of their economic dominance. They recorded this for eternity, and so they gave us our glimpse at the Canaanite captivity in Egypt. The idea of the biblical captivity, the bondage or sojourn, is a potent one in Western civilization, and we may never find a definitive answer to where exactly it comes from. But before I leave you, I want to finish with an anecdote and the thoughts that it raises in me. I live in a part of Auckland City, New Zealand, called Devonport. It's a nice suburb, and a few decades back it was a bit of an artistic hippie community. That culture has persisted in some great little local features. But lately, Devonport has been slowly filling up with immigrants. Not the kind of immigrants you might be expecting. Immigrants from middle-class England. They are selling their small homes for a tidy profit in England and buying up in the less expensive New Zealand. As a result, Devonport is very quickly adopting more Englishness, with shops appearing to cater specifically to English goods, more cafes in the English style, and the pubs are reviving in popularity. What this means is that as a middle-class English population resettles in my own backyard, they bring with them some of their culture. New Zealanders, or rather Devonportians, have to choose how will they allow this influx of English culture to affect them. Will they encourage it and celebrate difference? Or will they try to force integration and try to make the English become Kiwi? It's a tough question that many communities face at one point or another. Resettlement and migration is a tough choice for any family who does it. When it's done by force, like the Egyptians did to the Syrians, the pressure to conform might have been incredible. Now, people like Benya might have gone along with it, but not everyone is willing to give up their identity just for the sake of some advancement. I've simplified that notion a bit, but you get my point, right? Maybe the cultural memory of the captivity or bondage of the Canaanites has as much to do with the cultural assimilation that the Egyptians encouraged or demanded as it did with any specific mistreatment. When I think of the biblical account and the anger that you can feel in the description of the slavery, I am reminded of modern efforts along similar lines, how some countries fight desperately to preserve their language in the face of English language domination, how other countries reject globalization, hoping to retain their sovereignty in the face of merchant power, or how people of all races, ethnicities, and cultures sometimes must battle to preserve their own identity. When the land they live in might quietly want to take that identity away, difference may be obliterated in the name of uniformity. Perhaps, in the end, this is one of the main ideas that informed the original myth of the Exodus. Perhaps the enslavement of Canaanites, or foreigners of all kinds, was abhorrent not just because it was forced resettlement and labor on behalf of a foreign master, but also because the Egyptians tried to assimilate their captives into their own culture. If you're taken away from your home, made to work in a new land, is it not natural that you would want to hold on to a piece of your identity? At the end of the day, we will probably never know for sure exactly what inspired the story of the biblical captivity. As far as we can tell, life for the Syrian and Canaanite chemu, servants or slaves if you prefer, was perhaps not as bad as the biblical tradition would suggest. At the very least, what we see in artwork and textual references provides a broad view of these captives' lives and what they experienced. Of course, the Egyptians almost certainly sanitized the record somewhat, but it does seem like the supposed enslavement was less brutal and more cultural than the Bible suggests. Again, we'll never know for sure, and I certainly have not found the definitive answer here, but maybe it wasn't total subjugation. On the next episode, we're going to see how the influx of Canaanite and Syrian peoples influenced the culture of Egypt. You can't just bring 20,000 foreigners into your kingdom and expect them to have nothing to offer, right? Amunhotep II, terror of the East and master of captives, was about to learn that bringing Canaanite prisoners into Egypt en masse was going to demand some changes in Egyptian culture. To his credit, the king seems to have acknowledged this, accepted it, and even made some effort to help it.